where every clue hides a secret, and every secret has a story.
The kitchen light went out as Clara's fingers closed on empty air. She cried, "Mama!" and ran without pausing, landing against the pantry door with cold wood under her palm. Suspicion rose in Eleanor's throat like a dry cough. She pushed past Clara, heart thudding, and found the table lamp upright, but the brass toy soldier gone. The door to the back garden stood ajar with damp grass pressed into the sill. The household's problem was suddenly plain. Something or someone had come inside while the Marshes slept and taken what belonged to their child. Eleanor gripped Clara's shoulder and held her there, palms flat, as if physical contact could press the unease down. She the word aloud in a clipped, controlled whereabout. Someone entered the house. Robert looked at the doorway, at the narrow track of mud on the mat, and folded his arms. He moved his jaw but did not speak right away. Suspicion pushed his chest into a guarded shape. He suppressed it with a pragmatic voice. "Robert, Eleanor again, the toy is missing." The door is open. Her fingers found the silver locket at her throat and tightened on its chain. Clara peered past them toward the garden and said, "The soldier's gone." He was right here. She pointed to the carved spot on the table where paint had chipped. The three of them counted the small facts aloud. The lamp worked. The latch showed no break. The sill had fresh scuff marks. Robert set his jaw. It could be a trick of the wind. The latch was loose when we moved in. "Well, take better care." He rubbed his thumb along the seam where the wood met the floor. His hands betrayed him, firm, practical hands already searching for a fix rather than naming a fear. Eleanor's shoulder shook once. She kept the locket with a thumb and forefinger as if it were an anchor. Clara's voice sounded small and direct. "What if someone comes back?" She tapped the table where the soldier had stood. Her foot drummed a nervous rhythm. Eleanor answered with an action rather than a word. She moved to lock the inner kitchen door and tested each latch by hand. The pregnant pause after every click made the little house sound like a machine being sealed. When dawn brightened the narrow panes, they opened the shutters and stepped into a daylight that did not make them feel safer. The damp footprint at the threshold had a heel mark and smudged along the mat. It led away into the garden and vanished. The missing toy remained missing. "Eleanor, we should ask for help." Robert stared at her, then at Clara, then back at the doorway. "Help from whom?" "Robert." He set his hands on the table and leaned so that his weight declared reason. "There's no point in alarming the village over a lost toy." "Eleanor." He used the family name to steady the argument toward reputation and restraint. Eleanor answered with a trembling flatness. "Clara heard whispers last night. The locket moved in my hand. This is not only a toy. I will not let our children be afraid in their beds." Her gesture was small and plain, hands pressed to her chest, as if to keep something from falling out. Her voice lost its thin quiver, replaced by a controlled insistence that forced Robert to look away. Clara, standing with her blanket tucked under one arm, said, "Please, Father. I don't like the dark." Here her words were a child's measurement of danger and carried a directness neither adult would dismiss easily. Robert set his jaw and looked at Alina, then at his daughter. He felt the balance shift. The practical decision to ignore risk now seemed reckless. By mid-morning, Robert walked to the lane and asked for Arthur Vale. He returned 3 hours later with rain on his coat, spores of mud along the hem, and a satchel slung across a shoulder that had the steady posture of a man used to standing outdoors for long hours. Arthur carried himself without hurry. He stopped at the threshold, removed his gloves, and looked at the house with the careful attention of someone reading a printed page. Arthur introduced himself with a quick bow of the head and a short, steady word. He smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool. He did not ask for tea or argument. He only asked to inspect the doorway. He knelt, passed a gloved finger over the lip of the sill, and noted the scuff with a thumb. He not whined. It was the kind of sentence that asked them to keep still while he finished his observation. He walked the perimeter in slow arcs, dragging his gaze across the mud and the pressed grass. He paused at a narrow clump of heather bent toward the wall and found a damp shoe print that led away from the garden and toward the lane. Arthur called Robert by name and said, "These prints are recent, Robert." "Someone entered here tonight and left by the garden." He closed his eyes for a second and unlocked the measured tone beneath, which a private emotion moved suspicion of a pattern, a whisper of a memory that tugged at his sleeves. Robert stood with hands behind his back and let Arthur speak. "Mervale," he said finally, "can you stay and look through the house? I won't have my family frightened in our home." His voice tightened around pride and responsibility. Eleanor watched him, fingers twisting the edge of a tea towel. Suspicion had moved from an uneasy notion into a household decision. Arthur accepted without a flourish. He to speak to each of them privately. He listened as Clara described the candle and the sudden breath that had seemed to pass through the kitchen. He listened as Eleanor described the locket shifting on its chain and a faint impression that someone had put a hand over the portrait inside. He listened to Robert say the noises had dismissed as settling timbers and old pipes. Arthur's notes were brief, small ticks beside each report, a mental map that began to take shape. He questioned Clara in the nursery, while the other two checked the pantry. "Clara, tell me exactly where you were when the candle went out, Arthur." Clara sat on the edge of her bed and traced the pattern of the quilt with 2 fingers. "He was down here," she said, "the candle on the table. I heard a quick sound like breath and then it went out. I thought maybe the wind, but the curtain didn't move." She spoke plainly. Arthur tilted his head and repeated her words slowly in his mind, noting what she left out as much as what she said. Later, Arthur Eleanor to show him the locket. Eleanor unpinned it and held it out with both hands. Arthur tightened the glove at his wrist and accepted it. He watched as she fumbled with the catch and then opened the oval to find the small portrait inside. Arthur's thumb brushed a faint smear on the metal rim. "Eleanor, it was on my chest when I went to bed. This morning it wasn't there, then it was on my dressing table." I opened it and she swallowed and closed her eyes. "I found it like this." Her breath left with a small, sharp sound. Suspicion spread in the room and shaped itself into fear that the house had been rifled. Robert and Arthur checked the pantry door together at dusk. Robert worked the key in the lock while Arthur watched the grain of the wood. Robert's hands moved with practiced efficiency. He turned the key and paused as the catch resisted. When the door finally gave, Arthur held the lantern low and scanned down the inner edge of the frame. He found fresh tool marks, small parallel scores where a thin metal pried at the latch. Then Arthur crouched and peered behind a beam where the wall met the floor. His gloved fingers brushed something soft and knitted. He extracted a scrap of child's wool no larger than his thumb. He held it so the lamplight showed the tiny stitch pattern. "This came from Clara's blanket, Arthur." The 2 men exchanged a look. The next step was no longer superstition. The incident had moved into human hands. Robert's jaw, always set with reserve, clenched harder. They planned to keep a watch that night. Arthur drew up a simple rotation and placed the candle where the first incident had occurred. He explained where each of them should sit, what to watch, and when to call his name if they saw movement. His instructions were concrete and short. Eleanor traced the plan with a fingertip, and Clara hugged her blanket to her chest like a promise. Dusk turned to a low, drifting rain. The house seemed to listen with them. Arthur moved slowly through the rooms, whispering nothing but making sure each shutter latched, each bolt turned. Once, by the stair, he paused and pressed his palm to a wall where old nails had left tiny dark rings. He breathed in the mixture of lavender on Eleanor and the leather of Robert's gloves and let a private memory sit under his ribs. A visiting card once left under a child's cot and later a different doorway he had closed with his own hand. He did not allow himself to name that memory aloud. The watch began with quiet minutes. Robert sat rigid by the fire and kept his hands folded. Elinor rocked in an armchair near the nursery door. Clara listened for whispering under her breath and tapped her foot whenever she thought she heard a scuff. Arthur stationed himself where he could see both the stair and the pantry. He left his satchel by the door and carried the lantern with a steady, measured hand. Conversations were short and purposeful. Arthur, will you stay near the stair? Roberties, Arthur replied. He will watch the stair. Arthur, do you think it's one person? Eleanor don't know yet, he said, and the answer both relieved and tightened them, because it was an admission of uncertainty that invited more vigilance. Around the third hour, when the rain had thinned to a metallic patter, a faint scrape rose from the nursery doorway. Clara gasped, a single sharp intake that cut the room. Arthur and Robert rose at once. Arthur left the lantern on the table and moved to the nursery door. Robert followed with his walking stick planted ahead like a spear. They found the small lock at the passage had been jostled and would not catch properly. Arthur's fingers found the latch and forced it wide. The hinge squealed softly. Inside, at the foot of the child's bed, a scrap of paper lay folded. Arthur picked it up and smoothed it out. On the paper was a visiting card with a hand-printed name and a faint thumbprint in brown at the corner. Eleanor saw the card and staggered backward, her mouth open. She moved as if to reach for it, but Arthur stepped aside and held the card toward the lamplight. He read the name aloud for all of them. Madame Liddell, he said. The three faces in the nursery tightened with different intensities. Eleanor's hands went to her throat, and then to the locket at once. Robert's face took on a hardness that narrowed his eyes. Clara, who is Madame Liddell? Arthur's voice changed once, a millimeter of something like recognition that he did not let show. He closed the card back in his fingers. Arthur had seen that name before. He had handled a visiting card with that same hand and that same tiny brown smear at the corner in a room that smelled of boiled starch and a child's hair neatly braided. The recognition was a physical thing, a brief quickness at his pulse and a shift in his stance. He did not say where he had seen the card. Instead he asked, Eleanor, when did you last see this locket move? Eleanor answered with a small sob and a short sentence filled with concrete images. Just last night. I had it when I came down to check on Clara. It lay warm against my palm, and then when I rose it was on the dressing table. Her hands trembled. Arthur placed the card on the small sewing table and told Robert to inspect the attic acrobat. Check the attic now, he said. Robert obeyed immediately and left the lantern with Arthur, who followed at a measured pace. In the stairwell, Arthur paused and wiped a smear from the banister with his sleeve. He felt the weight of the night press against his ribs, and for a moment he did not move. He held the visiting card in the pocket of his coat and felt its ridge against the cloth like a small spur. He thought of the child in that other house and of a door he had once slammed shut to keep a secret out. That private reaction shifted him from detached observer to involved player. Robert returned with a small metal pried bar and a face taut with exertion. He reported a turned latch in the attic and traces of recent movement among the stored trunks. He spoke the facts in short sentences. Boxes shifted. A footprint in dust. No long stays in attic. Someone looked for something. His words landed with clear meaning. The intruder had searched the house with intent. Eleanor's knees went soft and she sank to a chair until Robert steadied her with 2 fingers at her elbow. Arthur opened the hidden compartment behind the nursery wardrobe with a thin, controlled motion. The compartment had been cut into the wood and originally covered with a panel. Inside lay the silver locket, its chain tangled with a strip of paper that bore a single printed name and a smudge of drying glue. Arthur lifted out the locket with the same care he would take removing a small animal from a trap. Eleanor reached for it and then stopped when Arthur did not hand it over immediately. He unfolded the strip of paper and found the visiting card folded into a smaller square. He recognized the same typeface. His fingers closed on the card as if to protect the name from being damaged, though the name itself was already stamped neat and clear. Arthur looked up at the family and said, "This is not a child's prank. Someone intended to return something to Mrs. Marsh, and then did not the sentence laid out a conclusion that forced them into a new configuration of fear, accusation, and dependence on Arthur's skill." Elinor collapsed into a chair and held the locket to her chest. Her breath came in short pulls. She nothing for a long moment. Robert paced a single circuit and stopped by the nursery door, hands clenched. Clara stood by the window and watched the rain track the glass with small, precise channels. The room's small noises, cloth rubbing cloth, rain on the panes, suddenly felt heavy with meaning. Arthur closed his lips and folded the visiting card into his notebook with a steady, certain motion. He ran a fingertip over the name and then set the notebook on the table beside the lantern. He did not show the memory in full, but the card's type and the faint thumbprint matched a case he had once handled where a woman named Liddell had demanded a child's portrait be hidden. That past case had ended with a slammed door and a name Arthur had since kept in the back of his notes. Robert demanded, in a short, taut set of lines, 3 quick questions. Who is Madame Liddell? Why would she be here? Is she watching us now? He each in sequence, voice rising with each. Arthur met him with even shorter replies. We'll find out. I have seen that name. I'll trace it at dawn. The exchange moved like a measured negotiation. Robert's anger and need for protection balanced with Arthur's outward calm. Eleanor's hands trembled around the locket. She reached into the chain and found an old photograph folded thin and stiff. She smoothed it open and showed them a small portrait of a child with a solemn face and hair tied with a narrow ribbon. This is my sister's child." The revelation landed as a new fact with a sharp edge. Men and women in the room traded looks that counted new pieces against old suspicions. Arthur took in the information and formulated a plan. He Robert to keep watch in the garden and asked Eleanor to sit near the nursery door with Clara for the rest of the night. He would walk the lane at first light to follow any tracks and visit the houses where Madame Liddell might have been seen. The changes in everyone's expressions were immediate. Eleanor's fear eased into a brittle hope that action might buy safety. Robert's reserved pride hardened into focused vigilance. They rearranged themselves around the candle that had been the first sign of disruption. Arthur set the visiting card beside his satchel and folded his notebook closed. He waited until Eleanor fell into a restless sleep with the locket against her palm and Clara's blanket bunched at her feet. Then Arthur rose and walked to the window. He pressed his palm to the cold glass, felt the thin vibration of the rain, and drew the curtain just enough to see the lane. He had a quiet resolve. Not the triumphant variety, but the steady decision of a man who saw a road and chose to walk it. He tacked the visiting card into his notebook again, slid the book into his satchel, and set the satchel by the door. He put his lantern on the table, wound his pocket watch, and checked its face in a single motion. The small rituals steadied him. Before he sat to watch the house, Arthur looked once more at the nursery door and heard Clara's small inhalations in sleep. He put a gloved hand briefly on the banister where the scrape had sounded and felt the faint grit beneath his palm. He did not speak aloud, but the movement sealed a choice. He would not leave Briarstone's unsettled corners until he traced that visiting card's name. Outside, the rain kept time on the roof. Inside, the family settled into their appointed places. Arthur sat near the extinguished candle and palmed the visiting card as if it were a map. He planned to follow the name at dawn. He would trace the small smear of glue and the thin thumbprint. He would question neighbors and learn whether Madame Liddell had been seen near the lane. He closed his notebook with a soft snap and put it into his satchel while the house breathed around him. Then he sat down, lantern between him and the stair, and listened for the next sound that would decide the night's direction. As the night narrowed toward a fragile quiet, Arthur's suspicion shifted into a precise, working curiosity. He would not let it become only fear. He would let it become method. He kept watch with a notebook closed but ready and a visiting card folded where he could reach it at dawn. And when he finally rose to check the latch once more, he tucked the card into his satchel and clicked the satchel shut with a single, definitive motion. That click closed the chapter's immediate argument. The toy remained missing, a visiting card had been found, and Arthur had chosen a path to trace the name at first light and to stay the night. He moved to the window, pulled the curtain, and watched the lane empty and wet. He laid his hand on the satchel and felt the card's edge under the leather, then drew a slow breath and settled into the small, watchful silence of the house he had promised to protect. The household slept, thin and brittle in the old cottage. Arthur sat awake until the rain thinned and the pale edge of dawn softened the sky. He kept the satchel between his feet, fingers closed on the leather strap until the hour when he would rise and walk out to follow a name. When he finally stood, Arthur slid the visiting card from the satchel and sat it on the table in the lamplight. He smoothed its corners with his thumb, closed his notebook, and with a final, concrete motion, placed both into the satchel and locked the clasp. Then he took his hat from the peg and stepped quietly to the door. Clara woke with her hand empty and the cold of the sill under her palm. The window stood open an inch, and a line of small, damp footprints marked the wooden edge. "Mama," she called, voice thin and urgent, and the single word shot Eleanor from sleep. Eleanor rushed into the room with the lamp held high. Her shawl fell open, revealing the silver locket that she clutched when she was afraid. She bent over Clara, hands fisting the edge of the blanket, and found only the indent where the brass toy soldier had lain. The discovery seeded a suspicion that would send Arthur Vale pacing the cottage yard that same night. Eleanor's first move was to check the latch. It was latched when I tucked her in, and her voice came out tight. Clara shook her head and pointed at the sill. "It was warm here, Mama." Like someone had pressed against it, Eleanor ran her fingers along the damp wood. She felt the faint grit of mud trapped in a groove. The two of them counted the outward impressions on the sill, and then the prints on the outside gutter, 3 small, evenly spaced marks leading away toward the back hedgerow. Eleanor's hands trembled. She smoothed her dress with a gesture meant to steady both of them. News of the missing toy and the open window moved through the house faster than a visitor's step. Robert stood in the doorway with his coat still buttoned, eyes narrow-eyed. Who would come to a child's window? He demanded, "Who has business here at midnight?" He sounded more angry than afraid, and his fists tightened along the cane he leaned on. Eleanor answered by naming the facts she could hold: the window ajar, the footprints, the missing soldier. Robert's jaw worked. "You must not tell the neighbors until we know more," he said, and his mouth closed around the worry of a reputation to protect. Arthur arrived before dawn, oil lamp tucked beneath his coat and his satchel slung over one shoulder. He had been called in the night, after the lamp in the kitchen had gone out while Clara reached for a biscuit. Eleanor had mentioned that in her trembling recounting. Arthur listened without interrupting, fingers resting on the leather of his satchel. One concrete question: "When did you last see the toy?" Eleanor lifted her china at supper. Clara dropped it on the hearth and Robert set it by the bread board. Arthur checked the hearth, touched the brass where soot had collected near the edge, and felt a sudden tightening behind his eyes, a suspicion that someone had crossed thresholds unseen. Arthur's suspicion altered his routine. He set the lamp down in the hallway, removed the lid from his satchel, and took out his magnifying glass. He bowed his head for a moment as if listening for the house itself to answer. He did not speak of his memory of Briarstone yet. He kept his voice even and direct. "Show me Clara's room," he said. He moved through the house with the same careful step he used when reading a line of fading footprints. The family followed, Robert straight-backed, Eleanor small beside him, Clara clutching her blanket like a talisman. In the children's room, Arthur crouched and inspected the sill. He ran the edge of his gloved finger along the damp line, and then crouched to the floor to look at the bedding. He held the magnifying glass over the cloth and found a smear of mud near the hem. He tapped the glass against the wood, measuring distance with an eye practiced in small detail. Someone came through this window, he said plainly. They did not crawl in to hide. They placed a hand, took the soldier, and left by the same route. Arthur's hands were steady. His voice was a tool that shaped the family's panic into something actionable. They followed him outside. The garden lay pale under a thin moon. Dew beaded along the edges of the path. Arthur crouched in the mud, spread his coat beneath him to keep his trousers dry, and traced the footprints with a finger. The prints ran in a circle around the house, crossing the foundation stones at a low point where the mortar had crumbled. They know the crawlspace entrance, Arthur. He pointed at a scuffed patch beneath the eave. Someone moved around the house without disturbing the boards. See how the tracks end and restart. They stepped across the stone, not the grass. That is knowing the path. Robert's mouth tightened. Who knows this house well enough to move like that? He asked. His pride and fear collided in the same sentence. Arthur found an iron key half buried in the mud beside the foundation, its teeth smeared with dark soil. He lifted it with a gloved hand and held it to the lamplight. The key was small and bent at one edge, as though it had been forced into an unfamiliar lock. He turned the key between his thumb and forefinger, and then slipped it into his pocket. This is not a child's object, he said. No brass soldier, but someone left a key. Either they intended to open something, or they were startled and dropped it. His tone pressed the family to make decisions, to search, to secure, to admit a wider danger. Morning arrived hard and cool. The parlor smelled of wet wool and burned tea. Arthur seated Robert and Eleanor across from him and began a line of questions that felt like an interrogation but carried the respect of a neighbor asking for facts. Who was at the inn yesterday evening? Who saw you come and go? He asked. Robert bristled. There were no guests, only us and the baker's boy who left before dark. Eleanor added, Mrs. Harrow saw Robert bringing in a trunk on the afternoon train. Arthur about tradespeople, recent visitors, and the cottage's former owners. Eleanor him about the small repairs she had noticed in the nursery and how, once, a builder had come and sealed a loose board by the corridor. She fidgeted with her locket while she spoke. Arthur's questions exposed more than routine details. He pressed on the line when Eleanor mentioned the corridor board. Was the board sealed before you moved in? He asked. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the locket and she said, It was loose when I first swept here, but Hargraves, he had nailed it up years ago. Robert hardened, paid for the cottage and the repairs ourselves. He said no secrets were kept from us. The exchange sharpened an argument about negligence and responsibility. Robert paced a short circle and then stopped at the mantel. "We want here," it said. "We left our child unprotected," he said. Arthur's voice stayed measured. "This is not about blame, Mr. Marsh. It is about facts that point to who has been in these rooms." The family felt the needle of tension move. Afternoon sunlight washed the attic boards in a thin yellow, and Arthur climbed with a lantern to inspect the space above the nursery. He sat with his knees on the sloped floor, the ladder leaning against the opening, and he pried at the nursery door's lower seam. The wood gave under pressure. Paint chips fell away into his palm. He found a stub of candle wax on the sill, blackened along one side. He smelled the wax and the faint, oily scent of someone else's tobacco. Arthur held the stub to the light. Someone had burned it within the last week. He pulled at the wallpaper beside the trunk and revealed a patch of repair older than the rest. The plaster beneath showed fingerprints set hard in dust. Robert joined him in the attic and took in what Arthur had found. Who would hide here? Robert. He sounded less defensive than worn. The set of his shoulders slackened as if a weight had shifted. Arthur pointed out the marks where someone had forced the small nursery door. They have been moving between rooms. Arthur, this wasn't child's play. They left a candle burned late into the night, and they found a way into a compartment that someone thought closed. Robert's hands were steady on the ladder rail. Eleanor arrived at the attic hatch and peered in, shawl bunched at her throat. She nothing, but her fingers pinched the locket until the metal creaked. Afternoon moved toward evening. Clara sat on the stairs with her blanket while Arthur examined the corridor's closet. He pried a loose board and found a shallow compartment. Inside lay a faded portrait no larger than a calling card and a brass locket similar in shape to Eleanor's. Clara reached for the portrait with both hands. "Eyes, why, she has the same hair as me," she said simply. Arthur took the picture and blew dust from the face. The woman in the portrait wore the same features Arthur had seen once before, long ago, in a ledger and on a torn page of a photograph kept in his own pocket. Arthur's hands betrayed a quickness. He thumbed the edges of the portrait and then set it flat on his knee. The portrait changed the geometry of the case. Arthur's recognition tightened into something more than professional curiosity. He had seen that woman's face years before on a registry card for Briarstone, a name he had read and then set aside. He did not speak of the registry yet. Instead, he described the picture to the Marsh family. "The portrait is old, but the woman is familiar to me," he said. Elena leaned forward. "Who is she?" she asked. Arthur felt the stir of memory and kept his face controlled. "Will tell you what I know after I confirm it," he said. His decision to hold back a detail was tactical. Revealing his past link too soon might skew the family into seeing him as biased. That evening, Arthur set his brass key into the trunk that stood in the locked nursery. The key fit with a resistance that made his fingers tighten. He turned it, and the lock yielded with a click that sounded louder than it should in the small room. Inside the trunk lay a bundle of recent clothing, a child's ribbon cut short, and a photograph face down beneath a stack of letters. Arthur thumbed the letters and found one with fresh ink. He read 2 lines aloud so the room could hold the claim as fact. "We have watched them since they came. We wait for night." The voice on that scrap was not a child's scribble. It carried loops made by a steady hand. Arthur's breath shortened. He set the letters on the trunk lid and lifted the photograph. It showed the cottage from an angle Arthur knew well. Painted at the bottom of the photograph was a name that matched a note had once seen in the town registry. Before he could speak, a movement at the nursery doorway made him freeze. He turned and saw a shadow, not tall but quick, slip along the lintel. Something struck the edge of the trunk and scattered a loose coin. Arthur lunged and the dark shape recoiled into the corridor. A short struggle followed at the doorway. Arthur caught at a sleeve and felt a small, panicked hand, then a scuffle and the sound of someone hitting a floorboard hard enough to make it thud. "Who are you?" Arthur demanded. He heard breathing, a scrape of cloth, and then a sound like someone forcing themselves through a tight gap. Clara stood at the foot of the stair, eyes enormous, and Elena grabbed her daughter's shoulders to keep her from moving forward. Arthur reached into the corridor and felt the coughing of dust and the press of a shoulder. The intruder escaped down the hall. Arthur tried to follow, but the angle of the corridor and the low light turned pursuit into fumbling. He held the photograph like a charge in his hand. When the commotion ended, Arthur counted the immediate losses: a few letters scattered, a single torn ribbon, and the knowledge that someone had been inside the nursery while the family slept. He turned to the trunk's photograph and then to the portrait from the compartment. The 2 images overlapped in his mind and changed their meaning. The woman in the portrait had a small crescent scar near her brow. Arthur's memory supplied the detail before his mouth could. He forced himself to speak with precise phrase. "This connects to me more than I expected." He said he grew up knowing that face. "I will tell you why, but not here in guesses. I need to verify names and dates." Arthur's admission drew a careful silence. Robert looked at him differently. Suspicion toward outsiders shifted to a wary curiosity about Arthur's ties. Dawn found the household assembled in the kitchen, the sooning light thin through the panes. Arthur cleared a tea-pot and set cups in a line to make a ritual of time. He explained that he would stay at Briarstone that night and keep watch. Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her cup. She asked, "You will stay?" Arthur nodded. "He will stay until I can be certain who comes and who watches. If this person returns, we will find them." The statement was both an offer and a promise. It changed the balance in the household. Robert put his hand on his cane and studied Arthur's profile very well. He said, "But you must be honest with us, Mr. Vale. If you have a connection to this house, we should know it now." Arthur placed the photograph and the portrait on the table and looked at each of them for a long moment. Arthur's past matters came to light in measured sentences. He had once been a boy who delivered messages to Briarstone, and that he had seen the woman in the portrait only in passing then. He had records of names that matched the inscriptions on the letters and in the registry, and that he would cross-check them at the town hall. He did not make his history a shield. He made it an instrument. Eleanor pressed the locket against her chest and asked, "Can you find out who wrote these lines?" Arthur replied, "Yes. I will go to the solicitor and the postmaster. I will read the registers. I will not speak of what I feel until I know more." His restraint displayed both his caution and his focus. The mini cliffhanger came that afternoon when Clara, drawn by a child's curiosity, found another fragment under the nursery floorboard. A scrap of patterned cloth, not unlike the hem of the portrait woman's dress. She showed it to Eleanor and Arthur, who examined the weave and its faded dye. "This is older than the plaster, Arthur." The scrap suggested someone had been in the house long before the Marshes arrived. He folded the cloth into his pocket, as if holding a mute witness. The discovery reframed earlier facts. The intruder might not be a recent acquaintance of the Marsh family, but someone tied to the house's longer history. That night Arthur set a pattern of watch. He stationed a lamp on the stair and sat with the nursery door ajar, the trunk under the sheet by his feet. He listened to the house, while everyone else pretended to sleep. He heard soft creaks from the roof and the settling of his own bones. Around midnight he heard a scrape on the kitchen window. He rose, put on gloves, and opened the back door a sliver. He peered into the sieve of moonlight and saw prints that matched the damp ones he had followed earlier. They led past the herb bed and toward the hedgerow. He took the brass key from his pocket and felt its cold against his palm. He made the choice to follow. Arthur moved along the outer wall with the lamp held low. He kept to the path where the footfalls would be least audible. He found the same small iron key lying where he had seen it the night before, now placed on a flat stone as if set down by design. He crouched and noted a smear of clay on its edge. Then he traced a narrow line of dragged fabric that led toward the low gate. He stepped through the hedge and followed the disturbed bulbs toward the lane. A distant dog barked twice. Arthur's shoulders tightened and then released. He felt fear, and then a practical resolve replaced it. He understood that whoever moved through the walls also watched, and that the next move would decide whether the watcher would be found or continue to hide. By dawn the family felt changed. They had a set of facts and a plan. Arthur would consult the town records and remain at Briarstone. Robert would repair the weak locks and pad the nursery with a spare mattress. Eleanor would keep Clara close and not let her wander alone at dusk. The trunk remained sealed with the brass key, now in Arthur's pocket. The portrait and photograph stayed under a cloth on the table. The household no longer pretended the house was merely an empty shell. They treated it like a place with history that required answers. Clara slept with her blanket tucked tight. When she woke, she kept her brass locket beneath her pillow. Arthur stood at the threshold and watched them move through the morning. He folded his coat, adjusted his satchel, and promised a final, Concrete action tonight. I will open inquiries at the post office and the registry. Come sundown, I will return with papers and names. Eleanor touched his sleeve. Please be careful, Arthur Vale, she said. He nodded once. I will be careful, he replied, and he added, and I will be honest with you both about what I find. He did not yet tell them the full weight of his recognition, that the portrait connected a face he had seen in a ledger, and that the ledger had once listed a guardian, alive or dead, who might yet have ties to Briarstone. A small, precise change closed the chapter's events. Arthur placed the portrait in his inner coat pocket and folded the photograph into his notebook. He locked the nursery door with the brass key, hearing the same click that had sounded in his hands hours earlier. He set the trunk lid half open so the ribbon and letters could be seen but not taken, and he left the bench while the family gathered at the kitchen table. Before he stepped onto the lane, he turned and said plainly, "Someone has watched Briarstone for longer than you know. We will learn who and why." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the locket. Robert exhaled and took up his cane. Clara peered from behind her mother's skirt and tapped the brass soldier hidden beneath her pillow. Outside the window, 2 faint knocks sounded in quick succession against the kitchen glass, measured and deliberate. The knock made every head turn. Eleanor stood and crossed the room, her shoes whispering on the floorboards. She opened the shutter a crack and found nothing but the curved reflection of the road and a smear of mud along the sill. Someone had tapped from outside and left no further trace. The household had resolved a small order, locks were to be mended, inquiries begun, and Arthur's promise given. The last concrete image of the chapter was Arthur setting the brass key on the table beside the portrait. The metal matched by the pale crescent scar in the woman's photograph, and by his own hand resting steady on the satchel. He closed the nursery door, pocketed the key, and turned toward the lane where, beyond the hedge, footprints faded into the wider world. A crash in the nursery sent wooden soldiers and a lamp clattering across the floor. A small iron key vanished from the bedside table. Arthur Vale was already on the stairs when Clara's scream cut the air. Suspicion settled in his chest like a cold coin, and he moved with its weight. He ran down the corridor, the boards under his boots answering with hard, quick beats. Eleanor's shawl slipped from her shoulder as she rounded the landing, Robert at her side with his walking stick clenched, so tight his knuckles showed white. What's happened? Arthur, but his voice held the same quiet attention he wore in the field. Suspicion pushed his hands to his pockets, to his watch, to the notebook he kept folded inside his coat. He felt the need to prove the house defensible. The thought drove his steps more than a formal duty. That need came from the same place that had brought him back to Briarstone. The cottage had turned up in his past more than once, and he refused to leave a family exposed in a place he knew had secrets. The nursery doorway gaped. Toys lay in a crescent of wood and cloth. The brass toy soldier lay on its face, one arm twisted beneath it. A small chair lay overturned. The bedside table showed a circle where the key had been and a dark streak across the varnish where someone had lifted it. Clara stood in the doorway with her knitted blanket clutched to her chest, eyes wide, breath coming fast. "Clara," Eleanor, voice short. Eleanor shoved past Arthur and crouched to the child's height. Her hand went to her locket and trembled there. Who touched your blanket?" Eleanor's question landed hard. Eleanor's fear shifted her into action. She scanned the room, pulled the curtains, checked the sash cords. Her movements left no space for idle thought. Robert stepped into the room, jaw set. "Someone's been in here." He said someone took the key. Robert circled the bed once, then twice, as though measuring where the intruder had stood. He kept saying the house would be suitable, that they could make do. His pride made him insist on proof. Now his pride turned to anger. He snapped, "Did you leave the window?" "Who left the window?" His hands found the brass watch and he fingered its case. Arthur held up a narrow hand. "Robert." Eleanor listened. He walked to the bedside, not touching. He lifted the lamp only with his eyes. The wick was clean, the oil level low but not empty. He bent and picked up the toy soldier, turned it, studied its face. Clara, he said quietly, did you hear anything first? The child's foot tapped once and she shook her head. The nursery provided facts: a missing iron key, a lamp set upright, the sash fastener slightly loosened, a smear of damp on the sill. Suspicion hardened into urgency. Arthur ordered, search the ground floor, check the doors and the stable. Eleanor, Robert, stay together. Clara, come with me. His sentences were short, precise. Each one moved others into motion. They split without debate. Arthur and Clara moved through the sitting room and into the parlor. Arthur himself, that fear would not decide what to do, he would use observation. He checked the front door's bolt, the back door's latch, and the cellar hatch. Robert and Eleanor called out, voices low but sharp, asking neighbors through the open window if anyone had seen a figure on the lane. A neighbor's man appeared at the gate within minutes. He reported nothing but the lane's usual emptiness. The marsh beyond the lane lay flat and silent. The cottage sat to one side, its porch light guttering. That quiet tightened Arthur's suspicion into a narrower focus. This was not random theft. The missing key and the settling signs pointed to someone who had known where to look. He thought of the portrait Clara would later find, of details not yet uncovered. The notion moved him from suspicion into a prickling caution. He tightened his hands around the leather of his satchel. They searched the attic by lantern light. Clara's small boots creaked on the ladder. She found a trunk near the gable and wrestled at the catch until it opened with a sigh. Inside lay a folded coat, a child's shoe, and a portrait wrapped in oilcloth. Clara brought it down. Breathless look, she said, and held the portrait up. Eleanor took it. The sitter's face showed a crescent scar above the left brow. Eleanor's fingers went to her locket at once. She drew the locket open and set it beside the portrait on the table. The two faces matched, the same tilt of mouth, the same narrow chin. Eleanor's eyes filled the locket, she said. Arthur watched them. His voice was low. Eleanor, tell me whose face is in the locket. He felt an odd tension, an emotion shift under the surface. Suspicion had become a personal alarm. The portrait's crest, a tiny carved shield at the sitter's collar, caught the lamplight. Arthur leaned closer. He recognized the crest, a small raven above a wavy line. The recognition struck him into memory. The mark belonged to Briarstone. He had seen it before, in a ledger under dust, when he had been a boy following up a case. The sight pulled him from professional detachment towards something like restrained recognition. It's a crest of Briarstone, Arthur Briarstone. Robert repeated, voice flat. Eleanor laid a hand on the portrait, as if to still it. Me mother said, the family left the cottage long ago. She whispered she used to speak of a child called Marion. Her breath hitched. A new worry threaded through her voice. Arthur closed his jaw. He Marion who? Eleanor swallowed. Marion Hargraves. My mother said she was taken in, then lost to the house. The family held secrets. She never gave more than that. Eleanor's speech came in quick fragments now. Her fear shifted to a slow grief that showed in the way she pressed her thumb into the painting's tear in the varnish. Robert made a sound that could have been a laugh or a curse. Lost to the house, is it? We pay for a home, do our work, and it caves with ghosts and tales. This cottage should be honest wood and warm hearth. He set his jaw. Pride returned as a shield. If there's a relation, let them speak plainly. He looked at Arthur. Find who took that key. The command had edges. Arthur left them and went back to the parlor floorboards. He lifted the rug and found a loose board near the hearth. The board came up on a groan. Beneath it lay a folded letter wrapped in oilskin, damp at the corners. Arthur's fingers brushed the seal, pressed initials that matched the crest. He opened the letter with a steady hand. The letter named a child. It spoke of a concealed door beneath the stair and of a name given in secret. Arthur read a single line aloud. Keep her where tongues cannot reach. The key lies with the child's toy. The words jagged the quiet. An emotion shifted inside him. Suspicion spilled into clarity, then a cold dread. The letter tied a child's fate to the house. It took the missing key from prank to purpose. Arthur called Robert and Elena back. There is a concealed door beneath the stair, he said. He kept his voice even, but his actions quickened. He must pry the boards. We must find the door. He set the letter down and turned the lamp's flame up with a fingertip. The light threw sharp edges across their faces. They worked together. Robert wrenched planks free with the walking stick as a lever. Eleanor held the lantern steady so Arthur could see where the nails had been eased out. Clara watched, fingers entwined in her knitted blanket. Each person took a task. Robert pried, Eleanor steadied, Arthur guided. The group action shifted their fear into focused labor. They exposed a seam beneath the stair, and with a final pull, a panel popped and fell aside like a trapped breath escaping. A narrow step led down into a cramped space. The air that rose carried a damp, sour smell and the faint metallic tang of old iron. Arthur's hand closed on the candle in the wall sconce as he descended first. The chamber was small bare boards, a low ceiling enough for a person to sit, not stand. A blanket lay huddled in a corner. A second, smaller key glinted on a nail. Arthur picked it up and turned it under the candlelight. Something moved at the edge of that small space. A gaunt figure shifted its weight and reached toward Clara at the top of the stair. Arthur did not hesitate. He stepped between the figure and the child and moved like a man who had learned to act without grand words. He thrust his shoulder forward and caught the figure's hand. The hand closed around his sleeve with a dry, clinging strength. The gaunt face came into the light. "Don't touch her!" Arthur barked. His voice filled the stairwell. The figure hissed, a dry sound. Robert rushed down 2 steps and grabbed the intruder's arms. Eleanor cried out and reached for Clara, pulling her back. The figure heaved and fell forward. In the struggle the candle toppled, and a flame licked the straw. Arthur stamped it out with the heel of his boot and kept his grip. The man's face was hardly older than Arthur's, but stretched and lined by months of sheltering. A burned crescent scar marked his brow, the same shape as on the portrait. He had a thin, urgent voice when he spoke. "Stop. I'm not a thief. The man said he only wanted my name is Joseph Hargreaves. I only wished to touch the child who wore the locket. I never meant harm." His sentences came fast, jagged, like someone dragging breath after running. Robert's hands tightened on the man's coat. "Joseph Hargreaves. Robert demanded you hid under my stair and took my child's key. You come into my home at night." Joseph's eyes flicked to Clara, then to Eleanor. Knew Marion. "I knew the family. I was driven off. I returned to ask forgiveness or to speak. They shut me out. I slept here. I meant to leave notes. The key was to open a trunk, just a trunk." His words tumbled and trailed. Eleanor stepped forward, voice small. "Joseph, did you touch Clara's blanket?" Her question held accusation and a mother's careful need to know her child's harm. Joseph's hand shook. "He did not touch the child. I have tended the drains and her shoes. I took nothing but a look at the locket once. I swear it. I wanted only to see if Marion's name was still here." I thought. He stopped. His chest rose. He was a man reduced to thrifted actions, keeping a candle, patching a seam, finding a corner to sleep in. Arthur kept his hands firm on the man's shoulders. He watched Joseph's face for honesty, watched the micro-movements that betray falsehood. Joseph flinched at the name Marion. Arthur felt pity and a renewed caution at once. He ordered Robert, "Hold him here. Eleanor, stay with Clara at the top of the stairs. I will speak with him." Quietly, Arthur took a step back and pulled his notebook free. The interrogation was not long, but it was sharp. Arthur direct questions about the nights Joseph had been in the cottage, about where he had got food and water, about whether anyone else had visited him. Joseph answered in fragments, then in longer strings of words when he found a rhythm. The family had once sheltered him, that he had cared for the last of a dying Hargreaves child, that he had been refused a proper name among the household when the old family line collapsed. "Why, take the key tonight." "Arthur." Joseph's face changed. He searched Arthur's eyes and then looked away. He found a portrait in the attic once. I thought it might explain why the house held such a silence. I thought the key would open a chest with papers, something to say who I was to them. I asked to be let in. They would not. I watched them move certain things. I thought if I could show them the portrait, they might remember. I am sorry. He stared at his palms as if they were foreign. Eleanor moved forward until her hand touched Joseph's sleeve. Did you reach toward Clara then? She asked. Joseph's voice broke. I thought that if she saw my face she might say Marian's name. I thought to make them see. I am not well. I have been hiding and I had little sleep. He faltered completely and began to cry in a small, animal way. The sound dragged at Eleanor's restraint. The mother in her reached to steady him, then recoiled when Robert's jaw set like a trap. A rapid exchange followed. Robert accused. Eleanor softened. Arthur for details. The conversation shifted their fear into something else, an uneasy, ethical decision. They could call the constable and have Joseph taken. Or they could seek another way, arrange help and find truth. Each choice carried consequence for the family and the gaunt man at their feet. Arthur listened to Joseph describe the crest and the child's name. Did you ever see a woman with dark auburn hair and a silver locket? Joseph nodded. There was a woman who used to read at the hearth. She left a portrait and a locket. I thought she might be the same. I never touched the child, never meant to alarm them. I only wanted to be recognized. I did not steal anything of value. The key I took tonight only to see his words were small and earnest. Eleanor drew up me locket, she said. She pried it open and turned it to Joseph. The portrait inside matched the face he had described. Me mother told me a child named Marian was cared for here, then removed. I thought her story was a fable. Her hands trembled. Robert's mouth worked. If you were so involved, why hide? Why not tell us? He kept to short sentences, the rhythm of someone who measures honor and cannot forgive stealth. Joseph's reply came rough. He was poor. I was watched. I was afraid of the sons who still believed the house was theirs. I had nowhere to go. Hiding was the only way. I thought to leave. I promised myself I would leave with proof of the child's name. That is why I took the key. I never meant to put the child in danger. He bowed his head. The exchange turned to a quieter phase. Arthur consulted the letter and the portrait again. The damp edges of the letter suggested it had been hidden for months. The portrait's varnish had been water-stained. Clara touched the corner of the painting with one finger and then clutched her blanket. Must not rush to punishment, Arthur finally. He heard the steadiness in his own voice. You must find the papers and the trunk Joseph mentioned. If there is a record, it will show names. If the house held a child, we will know. If not, we will know that Arthur's plan shifted the group's energies into work and away from immediate retribution. They returned to the attic. Arthur climbed slowly this time, each step intentional. Robert bore a spare lantern, and Eleanor carried the portrait wrapped in a cloth. Clara stayed near Arthur's heels. The attic smelled of dust and beeswax. Arthur pulled trunks open and rifled through letters and bundles. He found invoices, a bill for coal, a note about a nurse, and then, propped at the back of a trunk, a thin ledger bound in oilskin. He ran his finger along the spine and called the names aloud as he turned pages. On a folded page a child's name appeared, Marian Hargreaves. Dates followed. There were entries of milk rationed, a note about a cough, a record of a nurse's wages. Arthur read aloud a brief line, Marian given into care to Hargreaves. Key to trunk stored under bedside, signed E.R. the Hargreaves. The names aligned. An emotion shifted through the room. Suspicion and fear moved into a raw clarity. This was not rumor. It was in the house's ledger. Eleanor stood with the portrait. Voice very small. Me mother said she remembered a child like that. She thought the family had left. She did not say where Marian went. Her fingers dug into the cloth. The revelation changed her posture. She became both protector and seeker. Arthur felt his own past brush at the edges of his attention. The ledger's crest, the scar on the portrait, the Bailey's ledger had once pulled when investigating an old account. The recognition tugged at him differently now. It was no longer a mere clue. It spoke to a wrong that had been hidden. He had come here to protect a family. Now he saw this family held part of an older story. He shifted again, from investigator to guardian, with a personal stake in ensuring truth. We will not send him away yet. Arthur will bring Joseph food, and we will sit with him by the fire. Then we will walk to the magistrate if the ledger requires it. We will make sure Clara is safe. We will not leave the cottage to guesswork. He spoke with firm, small sentences so everyone could follow. The group moved to obey. They made a plan. Robert took the man's coat and found it full of small, careful stitches. He found a tin with stale biscuits and a brass thimble. Eleanor found a scrap of paper with a child's name written in faded ink. Clara sat at the table with the portrait and hummed a low tune, fingers worrying the knitted blanket. Arthur arranged candles along the hall and set a watch rota. Each action grounded them and eased panic into deliberate care. At dawn, a constable came from the village at Arthur's request. He listened to Joseph's story and the ledger's evidence. He spoke in measured lines and took statements. He made arrangements for social care and for Joseph to see a physician. He did not haul the man away in chains. He took notes and promised to follow up on the ledger's entries. Joseph sat with his hands folded on his knees. Robert kept his distance but prepared a tray of tea. Eleanor brought bread. Clara hovered and offered Joseph her toy soldier. Joseph accepted it with shaking hands and a small, stunned smile. The confession Joseph had given of sleeping beneath the stairs, of watching the family, of taking the key to seek proof shifted the chapter's fear again into a complex relief. They now had a human to look at, questions to answer, a set of papers that proved more than rumor. Arthur felt the tension slide from his shoulders in small increments, replaced by a steady duty to see the truth properly recorded and to arrange care. There was a twist revealed in the ledger, a marginal note, in a different hand. Listing a name, Arthur recognized Hargreaves alongside the name of a man who had once been the cottage's steward. The note suggested that the child had been given into the steward's oversight pending the family's move, and that letters had been misfiled. The twist undermined a simple tale of abandonment. The ledger pointed to administrative error and deliberate concealment by a handful of hands. The causal responsibility shifted from an abstract misfortune to named individuals, some dead, some moved away. That change altered how Arthur conceived of justice in this case. He moved from an impulse to punish to a plan to restore record and reparations. At mid-morning, a messenger arrived with a paper from the county. An inquiry into long-neglected estate records had been opened. The messenger's presence supplied the chapter's mini cliffhanger. Was the cottage's hidden history to be untangled by the law or by the family's own choices? The messenger's note required Arthur to make a choice, now lodge a formal complaint or trust the constable's careful steps. This external event forced a quick decision and paused them on the edge of consequence. Arthur chose to involve the magistrate and to keep Joseph safe in the meantime. He believed facts needed to be in the open for a proper remedy. Robert grumbled at public involvement, but Eleanor agreed that clarity would ease the family's reputation. Clara, small and plain-speaking, asked, "Will Marian come home?" And everyone went quiet at that direct question. Joseph had more to say. The steward had once kept a box of papers in the outhouse, and that he had seen men carry away trunks during a stormy night years ago. He mentioned names and small places where ledger entries might still wait. Arthur wrote them down. Each name was a door. Later, while the cottage breathed a fragile calm, Arthur sat by the hearth and watched the family move around one another. Eleanor mended a sock. Robert checked the latch. Clara wound her toy soldier's arm back into place. Arthur's voice broke the soft domestic rhythm. "Elena," he said, "there is more to learn. This house kept records. If we can find them, we can set things right for Joseph, and for Marian's memory." He watched Eleanor's hands fall still on the needle. Eleanor met his gaze. "Find them, then." she said, if there is a paper that says what happened, then we must not let the house keep it hidden. Marion deserves at least that her tone was plain and mother strong. She had moved from fear to a quiet resolve. They arranged for the ledger and portrait to be copied and taken to the magistrate's office. The constable promised to speak to relatives named in the notes. Joseph agreed to accept help and to stay in the village until the inquiry completed its work. The family sealed the hidden door and placed the portrait in Eleanor's care. Arthur made his final notes. The cottage settled into a brittle peace. The immediate danger had been faced and constrained. By noon the front door stood open to sunlight. Robert walked the porch and tested the latch. Eleanor set a kettle on the stove. Clara sat with Joseph for a while, and then disappeared to her corner to play quietly. Arthur lingered by the mantel and checked the pocket watch in his hand. He thought about his own reasons for returning to Briarstone, about the ledger he had once read as a boy, about how a house's record could be misfiled and how a human life could be misplaced along with a trunk. The chapter closed on a concrete act rather than a speech. Arthur led Joseph to the yard gate and handed the man a wrapped loaf and a sealed note directing him to the constable and the physician. Arthur's voice was steady when he spoke one measured sentence. Go to the magistrate in town at 2 and tell them the ledger is true. Joseph nodded, the nod small and full of broken hope. Eleanor placed the portrait on the parlor table and set the silver locket beside it. Robert shut the hidden panel and hammered 2 small nails home. Clara walked to the stair and laid her blanket on the top step where she had stood earlier. Arthur closed the front door behind him with a firm, deliberate pull and turned the key in its ordinary bolt. Outside, the lane lay bright with noon light. Inside, the house had changed. Facts were in motion, not whispers. The last sound in the room was the click of the lock and Arthur's soft, private relief as he handed his notebook back into his satchel. The immediate danger had been resolved. The ledger and portrait provided a route to truth. The family would not sleep without some unease, but they had choices now and a path to follow. Arthur walked down the lane toward the magistrate's office. His steps timed to the watch on his wrist and to the new sequence of tasks that would make the cottage's past legible. The door of Briarstone closed behind him with a measured finality, and the house settled into the slow business of being lived in and, at last, accounted for.